Okay, welcome everyone. My name's Emma Adams and I'm a convener of, or something like that, of the Complexity Approaches to QI SIG. So welcome for coming onto the call today. Gareth Evans from BCUHW, no, I've forgotten, what is it?
BCUHB, I'll pronounce it in a minute.
Yeah, I was not going to attempt the Welsh at all. So yes, if you want to do that in a minute, that would be great. So he's joining us and we'll be hosting this webinar. So a couple of things first before we actually start. So as there's quite a lot of people on the call, I would suggest that the best thing to do is to introduce yourself via the chat function. So if you mind saying who you are and why is it you've joined the call, what's been of interest to you. And Matthew and I, Matthew from the Q team, will keep an eye out on the chat and respond to that as best as we can as we go. And Gareth will pause periodically during his presentation to also answer any questions as they come up, if that's okay, Gareth.
That is great.
So looking around, I recognise some people that have joined us and some not. It seems as though we've got a big range of people from across the country, so that's absolutely brilliant. So just a couple of things. If you can mute yourself while we're on the call, and then if you want to ask a question, do so via the chat function. And then if you need to speak, you can unmute yourself then. That'd be great. The slides are going to be sent out to people after the event, and we're also recording the call as well. So don't worry if you don't catch everything. So we'll be able to share that and record that as we go. So without further ado, I introduce Gareth. So Gareth's given me a little bit of a bio, so I'll do that first, Gareth, if that's all right with you. So Gareth's worked for NHS Wales as an OD manager for around 5 years now, and prior to that was a mental health nurse for 18 years. That's right, isn't it? Yep. So he trained in human systems dynamics in 2017, and after coming in contact with the Institute through a chance conversation at a systems thinking event. So he's been a fan of complexity approaches and is a self-confessed anorak of those, aren't you, Gareth? Since coming into contact with Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework, have I said it right, hopefully. So Gareth uses HSD and OD approaches in his daily practice, and he's going to be sharing with us how he works to influence and bring about change within adaptive and complex environments. So we're absolutely delighted to have you. So over to you, Gareth.
Thank you, Emma. So I guess what I'm going to do in terms of setting the scene is I provide a HSD definition of what we understand the complex adaptive system to be, cover some of the core tools, frameworks and methods in HSD, share with you some examples of how I use it at different scales, so with individuals right through to services, and then at the end open up for questions, and then as Emma was saying, just check in from time to time in terms of what's going on in the chat. So are there themes, are there questions, are there patterns emerging? Okay, so we wanted you to just hold a couple of questions in mind as we were going through this. The first of these is, as you're listening to what I'm describing, how is this similar and different to the models and methods you currently use in your improvement work right now? And then, what are the sticky issues that HSD could potentially help you with? And by sticky issues, I'm thinking about those kinds of problems that you're dealing with that just don't stay solved. So what others might call wicked issues, kind of complex challenges. So think about those and how some of these tools and techniques may be useful to you in that kind of process of working with those things. Okay, so what is HSD, Human Systems Dynamics? So let's get the wordy bit out of the way first. So we talk about practice in HSD, practice being that continual dance between theory and practice. So how does theory push our practice into new inquiry, new ways of working? And then how does that practice then fold back in and inform the way we think about theory? So constantly kind of, I suppose, stretching and folding, which is a metaphor that we use for baking, out into the world and then back in to think about the ways in which contact with the real world shapes and changes the ways in which we conceptualize things. And it draws a lot from complexity science. Glenda, in her PhD work back in the early 90s, read as much as she could in complexity science and systems thinking, and then synthesized that work into human systems dynamics and the core model that I'll touch upon. So that's Glenda Eoyang, who is the founder of the HSD Institute, and I guess our leading practitioner. And when we think about intractable issues, we are thinking about those sticky issues. So things that when you take a linear kind of single variable approach, so we think about just changing one thing in a system or maybe just working at one scale, tend to bring about unintended consequences at other scales in the system, so scales above and scales below. So those kind of intractable issues where things just don't stay solved for very long at all. And then we make a distinction in HSD between problems and patterns. And HSD is a methodology probably more suited on the whole to working with patterns. It's this classic distinction of problem is something that's tame, it's finite, there's a lot of certainty and agreement around it, it's definable, the path towards the desired state is mapped, predictable, and is something that even if it's complicated, you can work towards in a stepwise fashion. Patterns, on the other hand, are what we would call non-linear, so they merge and flow and change at various levels of the system. They are wicked, they are infinite in that they never stay solved. So, so for me in OD, you could use a very simple example. Engagement is a wicked issue. You cannot find an ultimate point where everybody is engaged and you can just tick that box and move on. Even though we use scores and linear ways to map engagement, it's actually a wicked issue. It's an infinite game that you're playing. You're always looking to influence that. So in those cases, lower certainty and agreement. Okay. So since we're talking about patterns, I'd better define what I mean by a pattern. So when I looked in the dictionary, words like reoccurrence, recognition, repetition, and variation came up. So patterns are things that have recurring motifs. There are forms to them, there are themes to them. You recognize a pattern because it's the same thing coming around again, so it repeats. But within that pattern, you might also get some variation. So the pattern has a general kind of form to it, but within that there can be variations as well. So it's both repetition and variation. In HSD, we have a very particular definition of pattern. We describe patterns as similarities, differences, and connections that have meaning across space and time. And we'll explore that whole thing of similarities, differences, and connections in some more detail in a bit. So here's a tree that has a pattern to it. You'd recognize the fact that it has a root system, there's a bough, there are branches, there are leaves. And that's also a tree, and it's different. So there's the variation in a sense. And I guess you would also recognize the tree. So there's that kind of sense that they have a common form, a coherent structure, if you will, but that there are also variations and differences in that. So that's why it's really useful to think about both similarity and difference. And then what are those connections that arise within that kind of space? So this is the first tools I wanted to introduce you to. So we've already thought about what a pattern is. So how do you spot patterns in your practice? So we draw on something very simple. I think this comes from the work of Bob Williams, who's a systems in evaluation work. So start with generalizations. I guess this helps you ground yourself in the patterns that are evolving around you, because it's not always easy to recognize the patterns that you live. So in general, what do I notice when I'm in this situation, when I'm working with this team, when I'm approaching this particular piece of work? Somebody in the background needs to mute themselves, I think. We can then look for exceptions, which is beginning to highlight difference. So generalizations are about similarities, exceptions are about beginnings of difference. So in general, I noticed, but sometimes I saw. We still need somebody to mute themselves. And then, because in HSD we are very interested in this kind of idea around tension, we look for connections. So that kind of sense that on the one hand I saw, and on the other, so that kind of almost like polarities. And where are the tensions? Because those highlight key differences. And again, I'll come back to that in a little bit. We think about surprises, so the things that you don't expect to see, because that's novelty and that's variation. And those might be weak signals from the edges of a system that you really want to be paying attention to, because they will be the patterns of the future potentially when thresholds break. And then puzzles, I find myself wondering about. So the questions that, the patterns that you see and the patterns that you're working with, the questions that they invite you to ponder. So very simple, but very useful just in terms of getting into this idea about how do we spot patterns, and then how do we ask questions into those as we're going along. Okay. I'm going to do a couple of other things. I'm just going to define systems, and then I'll just to see if there's anything in the chat space. So what is a system? So this is where we're kind of getting into our understanding of what a complex adaptive system is. So I'll give you a moment to read that. It's a bit wordy. So there are our agents at the bottom there. So lots of different people with diverse experiences, backgrounds, kind of ideas, kind of personal histories, kind of memories, imagination. And in the interaction of all those different agents, and often, you know, I'm talking about them as people, but they could also be identities. Dave Snowden's particularly kind of the idea of identities being agents, be stories that have a life of their own, the kind of the stuff that's that arises in the almost like the invisible culture of organizations, the stories around the water cooler, so to speak. So things that kind of interact, they could be processes and systems as well, the kind of stuff that you're familiar with, artifacts in a system. As those agents interact, that starts to create what we would describe as system-wide patterns. So those patterns within the agent's interactions start to repeat at bigger and bigger scales. So patterns of culture, patterns of relationship, patterns of engagement, patterns of leadership. So you can look for all sorts of things. And those patterns in turn then reinforce the interaction. So there's a feedback loop created where agents create patterns, and then those patterns almost become constraints in terms of shaping future behavior. So that's why in that definition before we talked about semi-independent. So you always have your intentionality, you have your imagination, you have your multiple identities, which will always give you some autonomy and independence. But actually systems constrain us as well as enable us to kind of interact in novel ways. So I just thought I'd pause there and just ask Matthew or Emma, what's going on in the chat? Is there anything coming up yet?
There aren't sort of questions yet, but there's, I mean, you know, people mentioning really interesting things like Diane Ketley was just mentioning, wondering how this can help to increase understanding and spread of innovations in healthcare. You know, someone else has mentioned that they're developing a complexity-informed funding and commissioning practice using action research. There's just lots of interesting things people are up to and lots of interest, but I'm not sure there are any questions unless there are.
I think I had a question, Gareth, actually. I wonder, in terms of spotting patterns, is it, when we talk about culture a lot and we say, oh, that's the culture of this organisation, or that's how they do things around here, are we spotting patterns when we're doing that? Yes,
I think if there are kind of elements that keep emerging so that you keep seeing that, you know, if you're interested in the narrative, so if you keep hearing the same things in people's narratives, so the same stories being told, themes and kind of motifs arising, the same types of interaction. So people in a particular team can only interact in ways that kind of sustain aggressiveness, or people just always avoid any kind of creative conflict. Then yes, you're seeing patterns. And it is anything that has a motif, a theme, a kind of a repetition to it, you know, with opportunities for there always to be variation.
We've got another question, Gareth, around the difference between complex adaptive systems and not complex and not adaptive. So I think you're probably about to cover that. So I'll let you go with that one.
Okay, so yeah, I'll kind of carry on to that. I'll look at the landscape diagram in a minute. We'll look at different types of, I suppose, system configurations. Probably okay. Yeah. Well, But in HSD, we would say that all human systems are complex adaptive systems anyway. So we are part of complex ecologies. What we have the ability to do as humans is to bound and confine and constrain the systems in which we work in so they can become more ordered. But Glenda makes the distinction that they're all cases. And the complexity is all about the multitude of interacting agents and parts and different things at different scales. It's adaptive because people learn and systems evolve and new patterns emerge. So I guess that's the distinction I'm making in terms of complex adaptive. Okay. So whilst we're kind of thinking about this, it's really important to understand that this isn't a singular scale thing. We are immersed in systems, multiple systems. So those kind of patterns of interaction are kind of happening in our personal lives, our work lives, in our social lives. So, and all of those different systems are influencing how we show up in different spaces. The stuff that I deal with at home comes into work with me consciously or unconsciously. It influences the way in which I make sense of things, the way in which I deal with other people, how I interact, how I speak, how I think, my biases. One thing I wanted to say about pattern spotting questions is that it's always useful to do that in company, because one of the things that we're all prone to is our own cognitive biases, our own confirmation biases. We tend to see the world in the way in which we see the world. So I have a bias around complexity. I will always see everything as complex, and therefore requiring lots of collaboration and involvement and diverse ideas. And sometimes you just need to get on with stuff. It's simple, it's obvious, just do it. So we all have those biases and particular slants. So exploring these questions in company is a partial antidote to that, because you allow that diversity of perspectives to come into the room. So this slide, I just wanted to make the case that complex adaptive systems are multi-scale. There are always multiple interacting scales, and those different scales have kind of feedback loops kind of running between and through each scale, so that the largest scale of a system will influence the next scale, which will influence the next one down, and vice versa. So you kind of you get innovation coming up from maybe smaller systems and kind of more conservative kind of I suppose structures and patterns coming down from higher systems. So all of those things are there. So in HSD we talk about always attending to 3 levels of diversity as a minimum. The whole, which is ever the level that you're focusing on at a given time. The part, which is what's underneath it, what comprises that level of the greater whole, the level of the system above as well. So 3 levels of scale, so that you're thinking about patterns that kind of interact across those scales, so that you're not caught out by unintended consequences. There are always unintended consequences in complex systems. It's more about whether you can spot the disposition of the system so that you can anticipate where it's likely to go. Maybe a bit more of that afterwards. Okay. So, just some general principles about changing a complex system. We've already talked about it being patterned. So that's that sense of similarities, differences, and connections. It's also high dimension. So the sense that there are multiple variables, parts, agents, components, whatever your language, all of them interacting at the same time in ways that you can never fully hope to map. So the only accurate map of the system is the system itself in some respects. We can model and we can use computer simulations to help us kind of get a general sense. But there are so many variables, some of which are hidden from view, that it's completely high dimension. Complex systems, as you put there with the butterfly effect, Edward Lorenz's work around strange attractors and things like that, they're very sensitive to initial conditions. So starting conditions in a piece of work, so how you set something in motion, how you frame, how you engage, kind of sets, I suppose, the pattern in motion. And you can influence that once it's started. But history is a crucial thing in a complex system, because it kind of guides you to where you are. The other thing to say about that is you can't go back. So in a lot of change work, especially if you're thinking linear change work, if you get to a point where you think this isn't the outcome I wanted, there's a sense that you can just reverse the steps and start again. That just isn't the case in human systems. Too many things will have changed already. The narratives, the beliefs, the experiences. So you can't go back. you can only keep moving forward. They're scale free. This is a nod to fractals. So you tend to see similar patterns and dynamics at multiple scales, which is why we think about at least 3 scales. So patterns that emerge at 1 scale can have ripple effects and cascade effects into higher and lower scales. So you can start to change at 1 scale and you might see it spread, although spread and scaling are challenging things in organizations the size of the ones that we work in, often infrastructure and kind of, I suppose, mapping across different kinds of contexts requires some really careful thought. But there is the potential for scale-free change. And the last thing to say about complex systems, what differentiates complexity science from systems thinking, is that they're perpetual. There is no end state. There is no preferred future, no desired state. So from a complexity perspective, you manage in the present. And it's what Dave Snowden would call the evolutionary potential of the present moment. So what is fit for function now in the context in which we work, and what's our next step to try and increase our coherence, our fitness? So you're constantly working with what's emerging now. You can have a sense of direction, that's really useful, a kind of a general sense of where you're moving to. But the idea of specific destinations are a little bit of a taboo in complexity science. They feel a bit too linear, perhaps. Okay. So I'm keeping an eye on time as well. So I want to talk to you now about some tools and techniques in HSD that help us develop what we call adaptive capacity. So our ability to, I suppose, be in the flux and uncertainty of complexity and navigate it with a sense of confidence and curiosity. So we're going to talk about pattern logic, and this will touch on the core model in HSD called the CDE model, and Emma will be sending some additional slides from another presentation I've done, because I think CDE is crucial if you're going to take HSD forward. So these are the conditions for how systems self-organize, and we'll talk some more about that. We're going to look at the Stacey matrix, or the landscape diagram as it's called. So something that Ralph Stacey developed early on in his career. He's jettisoned it since, but we find that it's still a very useful tool. We're going to look at this idea of tension. So in HSD, we believe that tension is the trigger for change. So tension is a difference. And if you can find the sweet spots of tension in the system, you've got really useful places to start poking and prodding. I think in the systems literature, you call it perturbing, which is the fancy term for just giving it a shove and a nudge. One of the tools we find really useful for helping us navigate complexity, because complexity is stressful, uncertainty is stressful, we're not hardwired for it really, is this idea that we adopted a stance of inquiry. So we constantly ask questions into complexity and try and, I suppose, dampen down our judgments and assumptions. So this invitation to be curious, to be engaged, to be playful, to be irreverent with what you're experiencing. And then a very nice tool for just exploring, I suppose, narratives and perspectives is called For Truth. So we'll touch upon that. And then finally, our model for action in HSD, adaptive action. So for those of you who are familiar with liberating structures, this is the 3 Ws, the what, so, what, now, what model. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why that's a crucial, I suppose, model to have in mind when you're engaging in improvement work or building a case for a complexity-based approach to the work that you do. So again, should I just pause for a moment and just check the chat space? Gives me a chance to have a swig of pop.
There is a question from Paul Ada. Maybe I'll just read it out. What data does HSD use for spotting patterns? Is it big data stroke performance indicators or signified narrative data collected, mapped and explored by SenseMaker? Yeah, maybe start there. And then there's a bit of stuff coming up about Stacey versus Snowden, but I don't know. And anyways, that might get a bit complicated. But the bit about data and whether using SenseMaker is part of it, big data.
So yes, is the answer to that. So we'll come back to that in the last phase around adaptive action. But when you're asking the question what, That is the phase of the adaptive action cycle that is all about exploring the landscape as it is. So you pull on whatever information you have. So if you have big data, that can be really useful. You also want to be including the micro-narrative stuff that SenseMaker gives you really great access to. And although Glenda and Dave have their differences over time, Glenda is a big fan of SenseMaker. So definitely I use paper and pencil, that kind of thing, because the licenses put us a little bit out of pocket here. So yes, you can just pull on data wherever you find it. So hopefully that answers that question. We can think about Cynefin and the landscape diagram, but it's, yeah, we'll kind of come to that in a minute. Okay. So what are the conditions that influence change? So this is called the Eoyang CDE model. And this is, which stands for container, difference and exchange. So at the heart of CDE are these three distinctions. And they are the three conditions that influence how a system self-organizes. So what are the patterns that emerge? How quickly? How connected? What's important? And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about it, because if you get CDE, you get HSD. In fact, there is nothing in HSD that isn't covered by this model. So all of the tools, all of the techniques, all of the frameworks are rooted in this model. So it's the very heart of it. So a container is anything that defines and bounds the space. So that could be a physical thing. That could be the room. I'm sitting in a room. That's a particular type of container. It could be a geographical region. It could be a relational space. So Mary Ulbean's work around adaptive space. So those contexts where relationships between entrepreneurs and bureaucrats are really important. So that could be a particular container. It could be a concept, an idea. So Cynefin, the framework itself, could be a container because it helps you explore and make sense of spaces that you find yourself in. So it can be anything. Often we think about it in terms of who's in the system and who's excluded. So that kind of sense of a boundary. So when we're thinking about a team, who's in the team? Who's slightly peripheral? Who's blurring the boundaries? So you can define it in a number of different ways. We say that there are three types of container in HSD. There are containers that attract. So attraction is a container. So let's use the example of a charismatic leader. So somebody that has real presence and persona and attracts people to the cause. So your Steve Jobs, your Nelson Mandelas might be examples of that. There are also affinity containers. So that sense of connection via common kind of characteristics. So that could be culture, race, religion, sexuality, kind of complexity could be an affinity container. You have an interest in it and you find others with a similar affinity, and that becomes a container. So, and then the third one is the boundary, the fence, the thing that actually sets the space. So different types of containers. And I've got some further slides to share on this. So differences really are differences. They kind of reveal what's important to attend to. And you can think about differences in terms of types. So you might say that in my particular team, power is a difference that makes a difference. So who has power, who doesn't? Who has formal power, who has informal power? Is that power that you use with others or use against? It could be identity as a difference. So in this system, my sense of identity becomes really important. It could be who has the resources, who has access to the strategic level of the organization. So differences on whatever is important. So whatever creates tension in a particular team or a particular space. And then exchanges are what they seem to be. So it's that kind of sense of how do things connect and interact. So that could be people interacting, that could be resources or systems. They're all types of exchange. Exchange are either around energy being shared, resources being shared, or information. So that's how people kind of connect together in a given space around important differences within that container. So that is the core of HSD, and I'm just going to explore a little bit more into that. So that is a particular type of container. So this is something with a strong boundary around it. So you might want to call this a closed system. And within a closed system, you're going to see in terms of HSD theory, fewer differences emerging because actually there's no real opportunity to interact outside of this particular system. So the differences are going to be fewer and the exchanges will be tighter. There's a really clear boundary. So those that are in the system connect more easily together. There may be fewer people, there may be a lot of people, but the connections will be quicker. So this will be a system that self-organizes quickly because there are a few differences within which to kind of agree or disagree around. Exchanges are tight, they're often very linear in this type of thing. Okay. And then we get to something that's a little bit more, I suppose, emergent. So a different type of system where there's an open boundary, but there's still that sense of real connection. So I guess this is a nice illustration of a network. So lots of connections, but within this now you're seeing a lot more difference emerging. So a lot more opportunity for different parts of the system to be interacting and exchanging with other parts. So it's more fluid, there's access to the environment around, so information is passing through the boundary, so you're getting things in. So again, this is Mary Bean's work around entrepreneurial spaces and adaptive spaces, so all those network connections to other organizations. This is the stuff around systems leadership and when you're working across health and social care economies. So all those different things that allow you to bring novelty into the system. Obviously what this does is it creates more friction because leads to lower certainty and agreements because more opportunities for people to debate and to get into conflict. And in complexity, we move towards conflict because it's really useful. And again, that's, I think, a similarity between the work of Dave Snowden, who really emphasizes the importance of conflict and the risk of reaching premature convergence around consent. Mary Bean's work, she moves towards tension and sees conflict as a source of rich energy. And Glenda is fascinated by tension and dives straight in there whenever she senses that tension is creating a difference that makes a difference. And then finally, you have the kind of system where the boundaries are really loose. So almost like it's more nebulous. So more fractured, disconnected. And within this kind of space, it's actually hard for people to connect because there's too much randomness, there's too much looseness. So actually the ability to connect around particular differences is lost. So you probably won't see patterns emerging strongly, but in this kind of more loose space, you may well see weak signals. So hints and whispers of things to come that in a more bounded system will become patterns. So different kinds of containers, different kinds of system properties, and within that, different types of differences emerging and different types of exchange. Okay, I feel like this might be a point to pause and check the chat space again.
I mean, a couple of things that I've noticed that have come up. Francois was asking whether containers are more than just space. Did I get that right? Yeah, more than just space. And Karen was just, pointing out that it is a difficult new language that you're using. Is there a way to simplify it? If you want to respond to either of those, please do.
So yes, containers definitely more than just spaces. Like I was saying, they could be people, they could be ideas, concepts, all sorts of different things, conceptual stuff, relational stuff. So it's, space is an easy one to think about. Your skin is a container. Your skull is a container. A cup, a hollow in the earth. So lots of different things can become container. But I guess that's the metaphor of a container is something that holds. So a cup holds liquid. So a room holds whatever's in the room. So a concept maybe holds different people together. So it is a little bit amorphous. The way of thinking about this in answer to the second question is to talk about similarities and connections again. So Glenda did find that when she was trying to promote this model, that people were kind of looking a little bit askew. So a container is a similarity. So whatever the similarities are within a system, act as containers because they hold space. So differences are differences. There's no nothing there. And then exchanges can be thought of as connections. So what connects interactions? What connects the different parts of a system together? That helps you define what the exchanges are. So similarities, differences, and connections is another way of, I suppose, describing that, which is a way of describing a pattern as well. So hopefully that gives you a little bit. I have included additional slides that will go out that explore this in a little more detail. And there are some great resources on this model on the HSD Institute website. So you get lots of downloadable stuff. It's all open access. Okay. So what I thought I'd do is I would map this onto the landscape diagram. And then hopefully then we can start to think about similarities and differences to things like Cynefin as well, in a light touch way. So for those of you that may have not seen this, the landscape diagram is a way of thinking about two particular axes. So certainty and agreement. So what does that mean? So certainty for me is about the certainty of outcome. So when we're going to do something, how confident are we that we will get more or less predictable results? Now that's my way of defining it. Other people might have different ways of understanding certainty, but it's that kind of, that sense that we know what we're dealing with and we know what we're doing. And then agreement is, I guess, the consensus around, yes, this is this type of problem. It's a tame problem. We can define it. We can bound it. We can reach consensus on what the right things are to do. So when you're close to certainty and you're close to agreement, you have quite a stable space. So for me, this is the place where you want your payroll system to exist in your organization so that you can be pretty confident that on, for me, the 23rd of every month, I'm going to get paid. It's also the space that you want people who build the wings for aeroplanes to be working in, because you want that to be something that you feel pretty certain about when you step into the plane. So lots of human activities sit in this stable space. It's a great space for bureaucracy and standard operating procedures and all of those things that map what Snowden would call obvious problems. So those problems where you can sense, categorize, and then know how to respond. And that's stability. On the edges of stability will be Snowden's system space of complicated, where you still have a direct relationship between cause and effect. You can kind of have a sense of where you're starting and some sense of the trajectory of where you're going. But that's going to require some analysis and maybe some expertise being added. So that tends to sit on the boundary. So you can find diagrams where people overlay Cynefin onto the Stacey matrix. I'm not sure what Dave Snowden thinks about that. I've not had the chance to ask him yet. Okay, so that's a stable space. The next space is what we would call emergent. So you're starting to move further away from certainty and agreement. So you're not completely out of that space yet. So there can still be certainty and agreement, but it's less of both. So you might have a number of different ideas and a number of different perspectives and much less certainty about your outcomes. So in HSD, this is where adaptive action really comes into its own. In Cynefin, this is where you engage in safe-to-fail probes and multiple and multidimensional, so lots of different types of experiments in this space, because you may know where a system is likely to go in terms of its dispositionality, kind of tracking its potential trajectory, but you don't know with certainty. You cannot predict, you cannot control, so you kind of have to experiment. So lots of OD models, open space, appreciative inquiry, world cafes, they sit in this emergent space where you need a diversity of agents, a diversity of people engaging in conversations so that you get a rich kind of, I suppose, spread of views, and you can have that kind of conflict and that exploration till some kind of sense of shared direction emerges. And then finally, you get to what's an unstable space. So emergent is complex in David's Cynefin model. Unstable, I suppose, would equate to the chaotic space. So this is where you've lost both certainty and agreement. So this is chaotic in the sense that there are no constraints and that people in the system are unable in any kind of practical or useful way. So there's no connection. Very useful for sense making on a mass scale. If you're interested in that, because everybody's unconnected, so you kind of get that wisdom of crowds phenomena emerging, and it's very good for novelty and creativity. But if you're running a business or an organization like an NHS organization, then you probably want to bound the amount of instability that's in the system, because we need lots of things to be in a more stable space, or at least in the more emergent space. So if we put our three types of system on, then this is how I'm mapping it. So stable spaces tend to be more closed, more kind of clearly bounded. Emergent spaces are networked, and unstable spaces have kind of very loose boundaries, very loose containers. So how do you influence that? Because that's a really important question. And in HSD, because we believe that everything is either a container, a difference, or an exchange, and those can shift and mutate at different levels, you basically fiddle with one of those. So if it feels like you need more stability, you can look to create a stronger boundary around the container. So to maybe think about who's included in your kind of, I suppose, your improvement work, to maybe focus in on a few key differences, and to maybe tighten exchanges, so to have more kind of linear exchanges, more regular meetings, kind of agendas, things like that. If you want to loosen it, then you're going to want to increase the size of the container, to open it up to more people or to new ideas, or move into different spaces, get out into your communities and engage with different groups, because you're going to increase the size of difference. And then if you want to really loosen things up so that you've got novelty, then you want to create the conditions where people are more disconnected from each other, so that exchanges are more non-linear and the differences are kind of out and flying around. So when we're thinking about change and intervention in HSD, we're always thinking about which of these three things can we most easily influence. And the theory in HSD is, because these are interconnected, you only need to change one to see a change in the others. You don't necessarily know exactly what will happen, because this is complexity and patterns emerge, but you will see something happen as a consequence of changing one of these. So focusing on a different difference, so looking at power or identity or resources, tightening or loosening exchanges, so connecting more people together or reducing the number of people who are interacting, kind of expanding your container. Glenda would say that that's all there is in the world. There are just containers, differences, and exchange. But that's a more philosophical conversation for another time, perhaps. Okay. So that maps onto that. I wanted to touch on tension. And we use a very simple tool when we're thinking about tension. So when I'm working with a team or a service, and we start to get some of the data, and we kind of have a sense of who's in and who's out and what that means for those who are in and are out, I ask where the tensions are. So what are the things that are making a difference right now, either in a useful way or a not so useful way? And then we think about, I guess, these points of tension in terms of what polarities do they evoke. So this idea that you've kind of got this interdependent pair of things, and I'm going to illustrate that now for you. So decision making, for example, may be a particular tension in a system. And when we think about interdependent pairs, we don't just think about one, we think about multiple layers. So what does decision making have an impact on? So decision making might have an impact on capacity, so your actual ability to deliver whatever the decision is. Capacity in turn might have an impact on what you're focusing on. So, for example, as an OD team here in North Wales, we are now in the middle of delivering against a number of key strategic objectives. So decisions have been made at the executive team level in terms of a focus on things like retention and recruitment, for example. That has an immediate kind of impact on our capacity, and it also starts to change our focus. So if we're doing more of the big work, we're less able to do some of the smaller teamwork where we're looking at team development and we're looking at bits of OD intervention. That then covers the intervention itself. So for example, with decision making, this is a very simple example. So how top down or how bottom up is it? So what's the relative balance? And if you want, I wasn't able to represent this graphically. I don't know whether you've ever seen those DJ turntables where they have a sliding button where you can kind of move from one speaker to the other, or similar effects. So picture this as a sliding scale. So there may be times when you want to slide the scale towards a more top-down type of decision making. So maybe in a crisis situation, you would want strong, clear, more autocratic type of leadership. And then you might want to slide it more towards bottom up when you're engaging in collaborative, co-design, co-production type work. So there is no right place, but you will need to hold both in mind at the same time. So independent pairs invites you into both and thinking. This is not either or, either completely top down or completely bottom up. It's some relative combination of the two. So your capacity may be reactive or responsive. So how do you hold the space somewhere between reactivity and responsiveness so that you're not just constantly reacting and fighting fires, but creating some capacity for responsiveness as well. So thinking and anticipating and beginning to notice those patterns. So we keep putting this fire out, and we put it out, and then everything settles down, and there it's there again. So the responsiveness bit allows you to start to look at your fire alarm system rather than just dealing exactly with the fire. So again, what's the relative balance? Your focus may be on process or patience, and again, you're thinking about holding the tension between the two. And again, so individual population. So lots of, I suppose, interrelated differences that make a difference. And these are just 4 particular examples. So decision making might be a difference that makes a difference, that creates tension, because it feels like the slider scale is maybe moving more towards top down command and control. And you really need to kind of think about how do you hold that in relation to your capacity, in relation to focus. And what I do with teams is I just get them mapping this stuff out, mapping where they are currently. So they just put a line between the two, and then thinking about what impacts that has. So what patterns do we see as a consequence of that? And is that right? Is that the right place for that slider scale to be at the moment? And what if you were to move it one way or the other? So it's a very simple process, but it just allows you to articulate tensions in the system and to start to think about which are the differences, because there are always multiple differences. You can't focus on everything. So which differences do we think are the ones that make a difference? The ones that if we intervene in, we might see some change, some improvement, something different emerging. So these are just 4 that are things that I think about quite a bit. So just use an example, but they could be about anything. So that's one particular tool. I'm just mindful of. So I'm going to just keep it rolling now. And then
there are a few things on the chat I wondered whether you wanted to pick up, actually. There's a big debate going on about quality improvement and OD.
Okay.
And a sort of tension between QI being almost in the stable positivist space and OD being towards the more emergent space. And how do you hold those two tensions together?
Well, I suppose I'm going to invite you to consider what's like HSD as being a really nice way of doing something of both. So it's interesting how we make these distinctions between what an OD team might do and what a quality improvement team might do, because I know that in many kind of workforce configurations, quality and OD are the same thing. So again, we can look at those as containers and think about whether they're the most useful containers to conceptualize our interventions around. And why does improvement work have to sit in a stable space? Why can't it be about exploration, experimentation, testing novel kind of ideas, thinking about things that seem coherent? So does it make sense? Can we think that this might work? Let's give a little bit of resource to testing this idea out and seeing whether it starts to create positive patterns, ones that you want to amplify. And why is OD always emergent? So I think it's a really interesting conversation. It's probably a whole other webinar in itself. Certainly on HSD courses that I've either participated in or trained on, the whole OD, not OD thing seems to be a very powerful pattern that always emerges. And sometimes helpful, sometimes not, depending on how you amplify or dampen it. Okay. So I'm just mindful I've got 10 minutes and Matthew will be looking at his watch thinking, Gareth, you're supposed to have given some time for questions at the end. So I've still got some slides to go, so I'm going to move on. So I talked a bit about inquiry. So inquiry is one of the key elements to HSD. So we think about inquiry, we think about pattern logic, which is using the CDE model, and we think about adaptive action. So it's one of the key principles. And we have just 4 very simple rules. When we notice that we're becoming judgmental, we work very hard to turn that into curiosity. So we think about catching our judgments, not always successfully. Some of that stuff is unconscious and biased and out of our awareness. But where we find ourselves consciously judging, we become curious about the other person. So almost like stepping into their place, becoming an ally for them in terms of their perspective. Conflict is really useful, and we move towards conflict as attention, but looking to turn conflict into a space for shared exploration. So how do our differences enrich this kind of inquiry, this piece of work? So how do we find a way of accommodating differences? Not having them, because not always about consensus or alignment, but how do we hold differences in kind of dynamic tension so that they help us move forward? So we each maybe bring something unique and individual to, I suppose, the work that we're doing to improve things. It's that whole sense about defensiveness and feeling wounded and questioned and attacked. And how do you hold that and step into self-reflection instead? So not always easy, but one of the rules that we try and hold on to, so when you kind of start to feel that internal tension building, just that useful space, that kind of indicator to just pause and reflect. So all of the kind of the skills around mindfulness. And one that I have to work on consistently and perpetually is assumptions and questions. So I'm a classic person for making assumptions. I am the ultimate mind reader, fortune teller license, in date, not expired. And I have to remind myself that questions are more useful than assumptions in a complex world. So whenever I catch an assumption, how can I articulate that as a question instead, which helps me manage my judgments, probably aids in terms of kind of getting into unhelpful conflict. So just some very simple rules of standing inquiry that as a HSD practitioner, I find help me stand in that space where all hell is breaking loose sometimes and still retain something. It's a bit of ballast. So, okay, what's going on? How can I ask a question about this? How can I become curious? How can I engineer some shared exploration? Or what do I need to step back and reflect on in terms of maybe I'm privileging my assumptions over other people's perspectives? So all those kinds of things are really useful. And all of this is on the HSD website. Okay, so then we talk about 4 truths. So this is drawn from the work of Habermas. I am not well read on Jürgen Habermas's work, so if anybody has questions, tough, I'm not going to be able to answer those. I can become curious about them, and I can go away and explore, but there's just this sense that truth is a complex thing, and that it's subjective. So often in tensions or kind of disagreements in systems, it's our subjective truth, our internal truth about the world, my worldview, my map of the world, however you want to describe it, my frame of reference. That's what's front and center. So the most important truth to me is how it feels to me. And often when you disentangle unhelpful conflicts, the subjective truth list that you can draw up on a flip chart. So how much of this stuff that we're arguing about or just getting into unhelpful disagreements about is simply my truth, the way I see the world, the assumptions that I'm making. It can be normative, it can be a group truth. So the whole thing around social psychology and groupthink and, consensus building and things that we agree together. So this is beyond subjective truth now to things that we all hold to be true, universal and useful. And that's another type of truth to kind of explore. So what are almost like the simple rules that we follow as a group that are often unarticulated? And it can be really useful to try and articulate some of those group truths. And then objective truth or objective fact, if you want. So things that we can independently measure and agree on. So I'm going to stray well away from social constructionism and the whole thing about reality as a construct and just say that if I bump into a wall, it hurts. So there are some things that we can kind of reach a reasonable level of objective coherence around. And then complex truth is the amalgamation of all of those. And actually that kind of sense about which of these is most useful at any given moment, which of these feels like the most useful truths to be exploring, speaking into, and thinking out of. So it gives you that ability to just almost to dance with it in a sense and to kind of disentangle stuff and recombine things and just to kind of, yeah, kind of tease out and then sometimes just be with people in their subjective truth, because that is what they really need you to do. Sometimes to explore a group's rules or to think about new group rules, and sometimes to just look at the facts, the things that would stand up in a court of law. So again, just wanted to share that very simple model. Find that's very helpful in terms of team disagreements and kind of conflicts around strategy and direction sometimes, to really think about what's driving that. And then the crux of what we do in HSD. So adaptive action is a what now, what sign. It's iterative, it's continuous, because once you've mapped your current position, which is simply what are the patterns that I'm noticing now, and what are the containers, what are the differences, what are the exchanges, what am I going to do to usefully influence that, and then you take that action, what we call a next wise action, and then you just know, okay, so what happens as a consequence? What emerges now? And is that a pattern that we want to amplify because actually it seems really useful? Or have we just unleashed hell on the world and we really need to shut that down very quickly? So the whole thing around amplification and dampening, so Glenda and Dave have very similar views on this idea that you really need to think about how you're going to open up a pattern so that it spreads, and how you want to kill off certain things before they wreak ruin and tip you into chaos perhaps. And singular or multiple strands. So you might unleash a whole host of adaptive action experiments in a context, especially if it's around the more emergent end of Stacey's landscape diagram, because you don't really know what will work. So this is very experimental. So adaptive action cycles, because they move very quickly, you have that whole thing around fail fast, learn quickly kind of going on. If you're in that more problem space where it's stable and it's predictable, you can do the whole kind of thing around pilots. So singular models, testing and refining, testing and refining. If you're a Cynefin fan, this is the singular stuff, is the moving from complex into complicated. There's a whole new liminal aspect to Cynefin where you've kind of got a sense of what works. You're refining the method rather than exploring which method works. So pattern logic and inquiry underpin it. So you're constantly asking questions. You're constantly using that whole idea of patterns and similarities, differences, and connect. And just some simple questions. So these are questions that I like to explore. So what is the focal system? So which level of the system am I thinking about? Because that helps me think about the level above and the level below. What are the similarities, differences, and connections? So I'm obsessed with cross-scale interactions and interdependencies. Other people might not be quite so enamored of that, but I'm always thinking about feedback loops, higher and lower. What are we observing? What is the research? What is the data? So it's all of those things that people are asking questions to. So those what questions, almost like establishing where are we now? What's the pattern that we notice right now? We then move into sense making. Effects, what are the impacts? So what are the tensions? So what is important? So what do we have within current constraints? So what is coherence in this space? How do we know that this makes sense? That this is fit for function, as we say, in terms of the context around us? Because change within a space has to kind of have coherence with the wider environment. So what? And that kind of exploration phase is crucial, because it tips you towards the last phase, which is now what? In a lot of the work that I do, when I'm working with teams, I notice teams move from what to now what, because it feels so urgent and that everything's important and that you've got 25 different deadlines to meet at the same time, probably 50 deadlines, probably 75. So there's no time for that so what sense making. And then you get stuck in these iterations, because actually those are fixes that fail, in systems thinking terms. So taking time for the so what, the sense making, is crucial. But once you're in the now what will we do? Are we going to influence which of these? Are we going to work with differences? Are we going to work with how people and resources connect? The container? How are we going to measure? That's a whole question in complexity work. How do you evaluate? So the story is the measure, perhaps. The data is the measure. How does the data equate? So what is it that we're going to measure? How are we going to communicate what we're doing to the wider organization or to others in parts of the system that touch most directly on the part that we're trying to influence? So all that stuff around communication is crucial, because those are your exchanges. Now what are we going to do? What's our first wise action? And in HSD, we really set the limit on one wise action. So whatever your experiment, it's just that next step. Because then you're going to allow yourself to flip back into what. So you don't have a 12-year plan in HSD. You can do strategic adaptive action, but that consists of multiple cycles across a wide landscape of shared direction. So you're constantly iterating, constantly exploring. It's a bit like PDSA, but we're focusing on patterns and influencing patterns of whatever that might be. Okay, so Matthew's going to be going bonkers because I'm out of time, and I have only got a couple of slides left. So using this work in terms of networks, so engagement networks. So how do you help people build adaptive capacity over networks? So you've got staff engagement ambassadors, mental health champions. So how do you create a network that's coherent, that can flex, that can ebb and flow so that it doesn't have to be constantly engaged and all the lights on? So sometimes networks need to become quiet. So how do you build networks that have the capacity to stretch and fold? So you can use all these HSD tools for thinking about that. I use it for coaching work, for thinking about how do you help an individual move through cycles of adaptive action in terms of thinking about themselves, who they are as a leader, perhaps, what's important to them, how do they connect? That's CDE, identity, values, and connections in just a different format. About how you help teams move to the adjacent possible, to that next space where change is possible. So in Dave Snowden's work, he talks about more stories like this. So once you've done your sense maker narrative mapping and you have a cluster of stories that are moving you in the right direction on the landscape, how do you create the conditions for more of those and fewer of the stories that kind of almost like point you towards your negative boundaries, the space that you don't want to go to? So in TRIZ, in terms of liberating structures, that's what's the worst possible thing that we could design? That's your negative boundary. Run away from that space. So how do you move towards adjacent possibles so that you're not setting some ultimate goal? You're just nudging the system in the direction that it's already predisposed to travel. And you can use lots of HSD tools for that. I'm very interested in systemic resilience and how do you build adaptive capacity and flexibility across different scales. So teams, services, individuals, wider organizational teams. So how do you link those different scales so they don't compete and confound each other, but they actually have healthy feedback loops so that each level is enriching and potentially at times stabilizing or potentially at times kind of catalyzing other levels. So that's a whole other area of exploration. When you help a service think about its identity, its coherence, its development stuff, and then assemblages. So those stories, those they're called tropes in the English language, memes on social media. So the stories that take on a life of their own. So how do you help people disentangle themselves from the narratives that almost run their lives? So I am this kind of person, I can never change, or we are this kind of team, or nothing ever changes around here. So those narratives that almost like become stuff of culture and that have more influence than visionary speeches by visionary leaders. Because yeah, we've heard it all before. So the thing that you go to first when you remember the last time a big change initiative was launched, yeah, this is just another one of those. So those kinds of stories that have real kind of sticky power. And the HSD tools will work at all of these different levels. That's the bold claim that Glenda is making, that I am making. So you can take the same tools that you use with an individual and apply it to a network, a team, a service, a whole organization. So actually it makes change work simpler. Because in OD, you might have different types of tools for different layers of the system. In HSD, you say, nah, it's all the same. Cross scale, remember. So scale 3, it's fractal. So that's one of the interesting pitches that HSD makes, is that you can use all of these models that we've explored to think about change at all levels of the system. Okay. And
I have to stop you there, Gareth, I'm afraid.
that is time. So have I conveniently engineered time to have no space for questions? Or
yeah, unfortunately, I think we're out of time for questions. So what I would suggest is that we continue the conversation on the Special Interest Group website. So if you're not a Q member, we've find another way of connecting with you. But if you are, there is a Special Interest Group. Can I ask you if you can join it? put these questions, conversations on, and particularly think about the resources that a few people on the chat have signposted. So people have said, oh, it's like this model or that model. Well, please put those resources on so that we can all find them and share them. This feels like a whole new world in some ways that we're all exploring, and I think there's a great debate between QI and OD and all sorts of, and HSD and all sorts of things like that that's emerging as we're having this conversation. There's other videos as well to do with complexity thinking that are on the Q YouTube site as well, if people want to contact those. So I think, Matthew, is there anything else you want to say from the Q team?
I just wanted to quickly say that the special interest group on complexity approaches to healthcare is open to everyone, so you don't have to be a Q member. Anyone.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, that's good.
To join.
Fantastic. So all I can do is say, Gareth, thank you so much. Most fascinating talk I think I've had in ages. So thank you very much. And thank you to everyone across the country for joining us. Really, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.